Hello and welcome back to the Scale Up Leader, the podcast where you learn how to scale your leadership. Today we have Zoltan Vardy, a startup mentor and founder of the Launch Code, talking about sales at startups and how to scale your go-to-market strategy. I'll bring Zoltan on the screen. Hello, Zoltan. How are you doing? Great to see you.
I'm doing very well, and thanks for having me.
Excellent. And so I wanted to ask you to talk to find out a bit about what you do and how you work with clients and so on.
Right.
Could you maybe walk us through like who your typical client is and what pain they normally have?
Sure. So, my focus is really working with business to business tech founders who are in some capacity struggling with sales, right? So it's not in their comfort zone, and I work with them to generate sort of predictable revenues by teaching them to do three things. One is to focus, to
Yep.
structure, and to scale their sales and marketing efforts, particularly as it relates to selling to enterprise clients. So that's kind of my space. And what I've come to realize is that the companies that I work with, which are largely early stage, kind of seed, pre-seed type companies that are kind of going into scaling, normally will have a couple of clients to speak of,
Yep.
but they really haven't found the way to really accelerate their growth. And the reason they suffer from that is because they usually have three problems. First, they don't have really focused offer or message, right? So they can't really
Yep.
explain in simple terms why people should buy what they're selling effectively.
Yep.
Second, they don't really have a particularly structured approach to outreach, whether it's through outbound sales or through partnerships or through inbound marketing. And the third, which I know is your area of expertise, is they're not particularly structured in their execution, right? They don't have a clear set of goals. They don't track their performance. They don't
Yeah.
make decisions based on data, right? But they do it by gut feeling. And so that kind of combination of problems creates this difficulty, right? Because they're kind of in this controlled chaos, I'd say. And what I try to do is to help them address those three specific
Yeah.
problems through this system I've created called the Launch Code.
So, I mean, just going back to the pains that they have, how do they perceive these pains? I mean, actually, because my experience, a lot of startups, especially, but general companies, don't aren't always aware that they're missing those particular things. Like, what is their experience? And I guess related to this, like when you say they're seed and pre-seed, are these people like there's five people in the team? That they have a salesperson? Is it founder-led sales? Like, what's going? Or are there 20 people and a VP of sales? What's going on?
Yeah. So the companies I tend to focus on are led by tech-driven founders. So they're product people. They're not necessarily coming from a sales and marketing background. So in that
Yeah.
sense, they're much more about let's build a better mousetrap and we'll figure out how to sell it later. Um, and
Yeah.
and the type of environment they're selling in is largely that it's founder-led sales, right? So they haven't hired a big sales team, and maybe they have a co-founder who's a little bit more in the sales and marketing side, but they're kind of doing it
Yeah.
themselves. And actually, one of the interesting insights I've had from talking with literally 1,000 founders and probably doing business with about 200 of them in the last 3 years is that um, they think that selling is just about putting it out there and buyers will come, right? It's just
Yeah.
simple. It's sort of this Field of Dreams scenario. If you remember the movie,
Yeah.
Kevin Costner movie, it's like if they build it, they will come. If you build it, they will come. Well, if only it was that easy, right? I mean, unfortunately, in this incredibly confusing, overwhelming environment in which all of us communicate, as you do, as I do, it's just so critical that you get across your messages simply, clearly, and succinctly, and really hit a clear pain point. The
Yeah.
companies that I work with and the founders are already at the stage where they've gone through the pain of sales, right? So they
Yeah.
understand that they need to be able to do things differently. Whether they're so explicitly clear on what the problem is, I'm not 100% sure, but over a conversation, when you have enough of these conversations, you start seeing these patterns, right? And these kind of
Yeah.
three patterns are what I've discovered, and what I found is that the companies that first of all accept that there's an issue to solve, and second, take immediate action are the ones that are going to be able to get over that hump quickly, and
Yeah.
do all the things that come with generating predictable revenues. I mean, you can hire better people, you can invest in products and services, you can raise funding, right? It's not just about
Yeah.
if I go out there, Ballard can raise money. I mean, people want to see traction, and so investors want to see traction. So all of these things are what are there, and that I try to solve.
I guess it's often this case where they've got their first three clients or whatever, and then they've got some investment, and then their investors are looking for that predictable revenue, and then the pressure comes in, and now they have a
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you what, I remember
Yeah,
I remember when I, my a bit about my background. So I spent about 20 years in the corporate world in kind of the C-suite, so to speak. So in my last corporate job, I was senior vice president of global sales for NBC Universal International, based in London, overseeing 30 country business, several hundred
yeah,
million dollars of revenue. But then I've also sat in an empty flat, sitting in an apartment in Budapest, writing a business plan and raising $1.5 million for my own startup, $50,000 increments. So
yeah,
I've lived on both sides of that equation, and I think what I realized is um, that these founders are generally very good at the product and they fall in love with the product, but they don't really understand that you have to be able to take a much more structured approach to selling. It's not just about selling a dream; it's about going through the process of sales, and that's what I try to help them do. And
yeah,
when you get it right, it's pretty miraculous. I mean, just one company that comes to mind. I worked with a company out of Poland, a typical tech founder, founder-led sales. They were selling sort of a software solution for automotive manufacturers to audit their internal production processes, and it was a typical situation, right? So it was me focused communication. It was about what the technology is and why we're good. They don't
yeah.
really bother to decide like what is it, why is the customer interested in what I have to offer? And we changed the messaging there. We were able to become much more customer focused in the way that they position their product. And all of a sudden, they were able to close three very significant deals, enterprise level deals with German manufacturers sitting in Poland. So it was a really good example of how if you just make
Right.
some small tweaks, it can really deliver some great results.
When you say all of a sudden, is that how quickly is that?
Well, obviously, as you
This is
know,
this example.
with enterprise sales, it's a longer sales cycle. In this particular instance, it was a few months actually, which was quite unusual.
That's fast for enterprise.
Absolutely, very fast, very
Yeah.
fast. Well, but that's the thing, right? If you get the right message and you send it to the right person with the right pain point, the process can be quite fast.
So when you talk about focus, like I think we sort of you got the right message there. You talk about that, but you also talk about the right person, and I guess even the right company. I mean, a lot of people when I've my interactions with startups early stage, you think about who's the market, and they'll talk about the companies, and Ford is the customer, or if Volkswagen, if you're in the automotive space, is
Yeah,
the
yeah,
customer.
yeah.
It's like, okay, Volkswagen has 200,000 people, all right, or however many 100,000 people. I don't know how big they are, but they're huge. So
Sure.
you can't target a company, and you got to narrow this down, and even narrowing down to the individual persona. In the more narrow your target, the more your message can land, because you can afford to communicate. And I know in my own business, I now target a very specific set of customers, and by doing so, I can actually send messages to quite a lot of them and directly, and then so I am much more likely to have a response because I can afford to send those messages.
Yeah. Well,
What's your take on that? Like what's more important? Is it selecting the right people, or is it the right messaging, or is it narrowing down, or what is the right people? Right.
so I think you touched on perhaps one of the most important insights and sort of counterintuitive things that I have to convey to the founders I work with. I like to say, if you're everything to everybody, then you're nothing to nobody. And what
Yeah.
that means is effectively, if you're spraying and praying your message and you're hoping it lands, it's just such a long process. It's like trying to boil the ocean. It's just impractical.
Yeah.
So I think the one of the first things we do is to actually narrow down the focus of who it is that you're marketing and what's that value proposition, right? So one of the most popular parts of the program is actually the first module, value proposition, where we spend a bit of time identifying, like, can you explain to me what problem you solve for who and why you're better than the competition in a single sentence that a 12-year-old will understand, right? That's
Right.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
that's like step number one. And as we go through the process, you realize and I try to teach them that actually going more and more towards a narrow focus actually helps you accelerate faster, right? And just what you
Yeah.
described, right? If you can define very clearly who is considering your solution to be the perfect solution, not one of many, but the perfect solution for their problem, the more
Yeah.
likely they are to say yes, and the more you can accelerate your growth. If you try to be an average solution to a bunch of different customers, you're just going to be one of many, and it's very difficult to differentiate yourself.
So what if you try and be the perfect solution to everybody? Does that work? I mean, I'm
Well,
just riffing on what you said there, and
well, I mean, I don't think is that even logically possible. If it's your perfect solution to everybody, you'd have to be, yeah, I'm not even sure what the scenario would be where that works.
yeah, I think
Yeah,
my take on this is that especially at the startup stage, but even at the big company stage, you have to focus, because in order to be really good for one, you have to make a sacrifice on something else. And so
yeah,
by like EasyJet, for example, or Ryanair, they're really good at point to point travel, and they're really terrible if you want to have a transfer. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
really obvious part, but they have a bunch of other trade-offs that they do,
Yeah.
allocated seating, poor service, and so on. But they get you on the plane fast, get the plane up in the air fast, plane down again fast, and hence they can have low prices because their planes are always flying. And so
Yeah.
then they can win on pricing. But
Yeah.
in order to win on pricing, they can't compete against Lufthansa for service.
Yeah, so they choose their battles, right? I mean that's what
Exactly.
they're doing. Yeah, and you know one of the examples I use is actually from a company who used to work for Amazon. If you
Yeah.
think of Amazon today, it's basically selling everything to everybody, literally, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
When it started in 1997, Jeff Bezos sold a single product to a single type of customer, which was basically books to, I would call them technology geeks, because in 1997 those were the people that were using the internet, right? So
Yeah.
he built a business on the back of a single, easy to ship product that largely is the same, within scale, and can be sold to a very specific audience. And what did he do? Then he started adding additional complementary products, right? So
Yeah.
music, and then DVDs. People still had DVDs back then, and then through partnerships built this incredible warehouse of products. And I think one of the biggest mental obstacles that founders have to overcome is that, in fact, because you are focusing doesn't mean that you're narrowing your market. What you're actually doing is you're creating the tip of the spear that gets you into a buyer's mind, and over time you can slowly expand. If you
Yeah.
go first, into a wall without a pointed spear, you're gonna hit your head really hard, right? So it's
Yeah.
gonna be
Yeah.
it's going to be a very difficult path. And so that's I think that kind of mental shift is critical to start down that process of focus.
Well, yeah, one of the things that often happens with the startups that I mentored a bunch of startups some years ago, early stage ones, and they always wanted to have that total addressable market of like 10 billion
Yeah.
and this huge number. It's like, which is great, and it's good to have that, and that's a sensible thing. But at the same time, you need to actually target down to something that's accessible. And if you're not targeting to something that's like 5 million or something like that,
Yeah.
then as a startup, you're not credible because you can't hit that plan. So I always say to people, target down, 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 so that you've got something small that you can actually win, and then go and add the next 5 million and the next 10 million
Yeah, yeah,
to
yeah,
that.
yeah. It's funny. I was just helping one of my clients review an investor pitch deck that they're putting together. They're in the ad tech space, and I saw the slide. TAM, SAM, and SOM. I think SOM or
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah,
the three different categories. And it's funny because it's trillions and billions and millions, and I'm like, it's great, and it's great to have aspirational goals and all that stuff, but guys, just like get the first 5 customers right and make sure you're solving a problem that matters. And they're like, well, investors expect this. I said, okay, that's fine, and it's good to show that the potential market is so huge, but at the end of the day, you're going to build this business on the back of individual deals, one after the next, not on becoming,
yeah,
taking a 1% share of a $100 million market, or
yeah,
$1 billion market.
exactly. And if each deal is 100,000, it takes you a while to get each one, but
Yeah, oh,
you need to
absolutely.
narrow it down to like a small list of target deals, because
Yeah,
otherwise you're
exactly.
spraying everywhere.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Excellent. So once you've got through that focus process, we talked about focusing the target market. You've also got the messaging, but that's so interlinked, and it's also to do with the actual strategy of the company and the value proposition and so on. But you're narrowing down that focus to something that a 12-year-old can understand. You're targeting it to a small group of customers that you can actually reach with your budget and your people.
Yep.
Then you go into the build stage. Is that what your next
Yeah,
step
yeah,
is?
yeah. So I think there's one piece in the focus stage that's worth emphasizing, which is the product offering. So one of the typical situations that I'll come across in this is particularly in kind of tech service based businesses is their perception of their offering is we'll do anything. Like we're capable of
Yeah,
packaging anything together, and and we'll work to we'll tailor our offer to the needs of the customer. And I
yeah,
said, look, that sounds really great from a marketing perspective, but you're giving yourself an incredible headache because you basically have to reinvent the wheel each time. And second of all, you're actually passing the burden of decision making on to your customer rather than helping them down a path towards a decision. So a typical
right.
way that I manage that is I say, look, you might be able to do everything, but surely there's 3 things that 85% of your target customers are probably going to want, right?
Yeah,
And if you just do a bit of discovery and obviously go through the process all enough, you're going to identify this. So just create 3 specific options that reflect the best mix of features and benefits for your particular target customer, and set those out there and say, look, here's what we can offer you. This is our feature set, which is a majority of our customers would like. There's an entry level offer which gets you started but doesn't give you as much benefit, obviously, for a lower price. And here's the bells and whistles in the premium package, and this is
yeah.
if you want the whole majority. But if you provide that sort of scoping and that structure for product offering, it actually helps accelerate the sales process significantly because you're actually reducing the time it takes for your customers to understand what you're selling.
So by
And so that,
reducing the choice.
yeah, just by reducing a choice. And again, it's a bit counterintuitive because you're saying, well, if reducing choice, we might be missing out. Well, actually, what you're doing is you're helping people come to a decision quicker. It's like
Yeah.
going to I don't know the last time you went to buy toothpaste in a drugstore. I mean, it's mind boggling, right? I mean, you go in there
Yeah.
and there's like literally 17 versions of Colgate and 18 versions of
I know.
Crest and 20, and it's just over. And you're like, you just grab something, whatever happens to be closest, because at the end of the day, it's such a confusing process. And so I think you can't afford to be that when you're an early stage company. You've got to make it very simple for people to say yes to whatever it is you're offering.
Yeah. And I guess
That's a
once
critical
you're being
element to the focus. Yeah.
and once you're being
Okay.
specific, you also get the feedback loop of like this works or this doesn't work.
Yeah,
So then you
exactly.
can change it. Whereas if it's kind of everything, well, you have no feedback because
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Because you don't know what you
interesting.
don't have anything to compare your proposal to
Yeah.
get to the second point, which is the build pillar of the launch code. That's where we take the focus of offer a message and we basically apply it to a very focused or structured sales process. And I think here, I like to say, when you're invading a new country, or not that I've invaded a new country, but when you're organizing an invasion,
Yeah.
you go by land, air, and sea, right? So it's a
Yeah.
coordinated effort, and it's the same way in when you're building your sales process. It's outbound, it's partnerships, and it's inbound, right? You've got to use all three to various levels of focus and various levels of effectiveness, but you should be thinking about all three. And so, the first step of that is you fine tune your ideal customer profile. You really decide who it is you want to speak to, and there's nothing wrong with simply going out and researching and finding the companies, and within the companies the decision makers who match that profile, right? So
Yeah.
you've got to go through the work, and you put together a list of 50, what I call your hit list, your 50 customers, and you start finding your hooks, right? Your connections to those people, whether it's through network, through common background, through common, this is where LinkedIn comes in as a great tool. um,
Yeah.
you start focusing on, you take them through that sales pipeline to a decision. Then you go to partnerships, which I think is an extremely important part of the sales process for early stage companies. Why? There are basically two fundamental obstacles that companies face. They lack reach and they lack credibility, right? If you're a young
Yep.
company, you probably don't have a lot of network or reach. And the second is people don't really take you that seriously. So what's a great way to work around that? Work with people who add that level of credibility and reach to you. So that's where you can start
Yeah.
working with resellers and distributors and what I call connectors, kind of, trade organizations, things like that. And so that's a great way to expand the impact of your sales. And then finally, inbound marketing, which we were both very active in, on LinkedIn in terms of
Yeah.
content and messaging and all that stuff. That's the long game, right? I mean, it's you sometimes meet with founders. They'll say, well, I post once a week on Facebook. I'm like, well, that's great, but nobody takes notice of that because unfortunately you're going to be lost in the
The
in the in
noise.
the in the noise. You have to create a much more structured way, and you can do that by creating some very clear messages, building content on LinkedIn, sharing that content in events, at conferences as a
Yeah.
speaker, as a panel leader, and also using it as part of your PR strategy. So all of these elements, I think, combine to give you that structured process, which ultimately will lead your ability to generate predictable revenues.
One of the things, I mean, I've certainly gone through in my own journey, going through learning about these things as well, and sort of like starting out with just outbound and with a couple of partnerships, and then doing some inbound stuff like working on content and so on. What I found all the way along is each one of these things. There's so much to learn and so much to adapt, and I completely underestimated. Mentally, I estimated marketing is significant, but I completely underestimated how big a job marketing is even for a solopreneur. I mean, I'd like to spend most of my time delivering, but at the same time, marketing is the thing that enables me to deliver,
Of course,
right?
yeah,
And so it's
you
just
can't
such a
ignore it.
huge,
Yeah,
huge thing. And one of the things that I found super interesting about those people, particularly people who are posting once a day or whatever like that, often if you haven't taken a professional view of how you're doing your inbound marketing, how you're doing your content, especially on a place like LinkedIn, people tend to just post stuff that they think is interesting.
yeah,
And I know one guy that I know has as his profile just sort of a list of like three or four completely different things that he does,
yeah,
and then he posts on random topics like social justice topics, and then environment topics, and then a bit
yeah.
of business here and there, and a bit of strategy, and a bit of sales, and so on. And what I know this guy, and I know he's actually really good at sales and partnerships, and I'd love to recommend him, but I kind of can't because if I
You don't know what
recommend
to
him and someone
recommend
looks at
for,
him,
right? You know what
someone
he's
looks at
good
him and
at.
goes, "Well, he's not sales and marketing; he's social justice."
Yeah, yeah,
and so,
absolutely.
and
Well, yeah, I mean, I completely resonate with what I've noticed as well. And I have to say, a call out to you. I think you're a great example of somebody who picks a topic and just really, really drives that. I mean, every single post I see from you is OKRs, literally every single one. I marvel at the number of perspectives you can bring to OKRs.
Yeah, yeah,
Generally, frankly, I really do. But it is a very clear message. Like nobody's going to confuse what you focus on. 100%.
yeah, yeah,
I chose a little bit of a broader. So my core is always B2B sales, for early stage companies. But I do post things on entrepreneurship, which is a little bit broader. I do post some stuff on international expansion, which is kind of a segment of what I do. So I've picked
yeah,
three topics. But when you have 4 or 5 things that are completely unrelated, then they're not going to be irrelevant. And it's great because once one of the companies I took through the program is a typical customer in my mind, so a very tech focused guy, a bit of an introvert,
yeah.
not comfortable with sales and marketing, but I was able to convince him of the importance of getting on LinkedIn in a meaningful way. And it's really interesting. Once you accept the principles behind it, it actually becomes really valuable. I mean, this guy is now posting selfies and doing live videos. I mean, you got to imagine this guy was extremely introverted. Like, no way he would have ever
Wow.
thought. And what he's actually experiencing now is that all of a sudden people are recognizing him within his field, which is a very narrow segment of technology related to database management. And he was, I had a chat with him the other day, and he's like, look, people are finding me with these, people I never thought would even get in touch with me. They're reaching out to me. They recognize me, and it's just simply by being present and being there in a meaningful way and adding value. It really opens you up to a lot of opportunities. And the best thing is, it's still, for startup founders, it's still an underutilized method of communication. So you can
It
really stick
is.
out if you do it well.
I've seen so many startup founders underutilizing it, to be honest, and it makes a lot of sense. I mean, and it really links that whole focus and build things, because I think with your network, you can focus the network with connecting to people who are the right
Yeah.
people. You focus your profile on describing who you are in a way that matters to them, and
Yeah.
then you focus your messaging on things. I mean, I did the same thing. I had exactly the same experience where, just like you said there, what I do from my posts, and I post on a bit of management, a bit of other things as well, a bit of a slightly broader topic, but they're all complementary. And
Yeah.
so it's not. I resist posting on anything else
Yeah.
generally, because it distracts from that. And what I find is that every person I speak to, if they're connected to me on LinkedIn at all, they know what I'm about. And that
Yeah.
means that what that means for me is that if they ever come across someone who's my customer, they can refer me. And
Yeah.
that's what I think you're getting at here, is that
Yeah.
you're going through that structured sales model to create the mechanisms for referrals, to create the mechanisms for inbound leads, to create the mechanisms for partnerships, and to sow
Yeah.
the ground for outbound sales.
Yeah, absolutely, and they really are complementary, right? I mean, I think the reason I always emphasize outbound sales to start is because you have to go through the pain of direct contact with customers to understand their pain points, understand their challenges, understand what needs to be adjusted in your product offering in order to be more
Yeah,
relevant. So one of the biggest mistakes I see founders, especially technology based founders, do is they're like, okay, well, let me hire somebody to do my sales, or let me outsource this, or
yeah,
my favorite is these. I don't know how about you. I must get 5 emails a day or a week from lead generation companies, right? And they're like,
yeah,
well, I'll find a lead generation person, and then they'll do it. And I'm like, look, you can't run a marathon until you actually train for the marathon, right? So you've got to be able to go through that, experience
yeah,
the direct contact with customers. And so if you do that well in outbound sales, that actually informs all of the messaging you use in inbound marketing, the type of partners you work with. I just had breakfast this morning with a client of mine who's in from Switzerland, and he runs again a technology business in that, by coincidence, a database management company. And he was saying how that the people that he was reaching out to were really focused on this very niche area of what he's working on. And the more he's been able to focus on those type of customers, the more traction he's gotten in terms of inbound leads, and he's now using
yeah.
those messaging to get invited to panels and conferences. And you can take those things and you can apply them to different contexts.
Yeah, so the build and the focus stage really sort of like, it's not necessarily you do some focus and now you go into build and we don't focus anymore.
Yeah,
They're very complementary, especially that outbound, because
absolutely.
you get that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's
Yeah.
it's it's such it can feel frustrating in some ways, because you feel like you've done the work to focus, and then you go and learn something and you're like, damn it, I'm
It's
wrong.
it actually is literally never done It's just a different stage of imperfect.
Yeah.
It's like, if I think of my own journey, I had a much broader audience, I had a much broader target, much broader service. And, at the end of the day, you just go more and more and more focused. And look, the same thing happens with B2B tech founders.
Yeah.
The more you get to that perfect situation, target. And I like to use Calendly as a great example. Calendly is a tech business I'd never heard of before the pandemic.
Yeah.
And when that sort of need came out, where you had to kind of organize a lot of people through, to take part in video chats, it's effectively a hammer for a nail, right? I mean, I want to organize a big meeting. Here's a link. Everybody, tell me where where you're available, right? So it's just a one thing. And then they've since added literally 50 different features, but frankly, I just
Yeah.
use it for the one thing, right? Because that's what it
Yeah. Yeah.
really is, man.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. When you talk about you talked about like you have to do it yourself. I completely agree with this, kind of, and let me explain what I mean by this.
Hmm.
Because I think that uh, um, uh, it doesn't mean I don't think that it's necessary to do all of the things yourself. I think you need to find ways to maximize the time that you're spending learning the right things, so your exposure to clients. But as an example, for me, I have some people helping me with this. Will be a video in some places. I'm not doing the video editing.
Of course.
Um, some of the writing that I do, I come up with the ideas and I speak them to someone. I talk to someone and they take notes, and then they turn some of these things into posts that
Right.
then I edit and then post, because it comes out as my voice, but it actually works much better for them to do the writing because that's what they're good at. And all these sorts
Uh-huh.
of things, you can get people to do various things for you, and so on. So as a solopreneur, it's really important because it's only one of them.
Absolutely. And for me, I mean, I just want to clarify my point of view is that you can't, as a founder, avoid the process of outbound sales and
Yeah,
taking part in the process of outbound sales. But absolutely, I mean, look, there are only 24 hours in the day, and there's only one of you, right? So there's
exactly.
literally there's physical limits to what you can achieve. So absolutely, you have to be able to delegate, and as you build your team, and that's actually what the third pillar is all about: is how do you become much more efficient in terms of execution.
Yeah,
You have to find those different elements. But I just think it's really important that you personally, as a founder, experience the sales process yourself, so you get unfettered, completely pure feedback from your customers, and not screened through layers of
yeah.
people who may or may not even be employees of your company. You know.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. So let's go on to the execute phase. Is this and I guess with focus and build, this is not a matter of like we have a gate and we go, now we finish. I mean, maybe your engagement with them is a bit more gated because it's more structured about how you engage. But I'm imagining that people are still focusing while they're executing and still doing some building
Oh,
while they're
absolutely.
executing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they build on each other, but they're all dependent on each other, right? So
Yeah,
they're yeah. So it's not like it's like one is done and then you kind of move on. It's like a constant flow. The third pillar is about executing based on targets, which could be something I think close to your heart. So one of the things that I've experienced continually in my work with founders is they um, by and large have not experienced what it's like to work in a more structured corporate environment.
yeah,
I did it for 20 years. I've done kind of the entrepreneurial thing for 10. So I got that imbued in me as a 20-year-old, and I've been very fortunate to have that because it gives me structure. For a lot of founders, just the simple process of saying, okay, guys, there's literally 50 things you could do. Like, what are the three most important things you should focus on in the next 3 months? Like just
yeah,
having that conversation. I call that goal setting. But it's basically here. What are the three things you focus on? What are some goals that you've set across those three focus areas, and what are some KPIs you're going to use to track your performance? Like in a
yeah,
nutshell. And I think that process itself, by helping them narrow their attention and just saying no to stuff that doesn't fall into that category, is such a powerful tool, right? I don't know
yeah,
how it is with you, but like one of the most difficult things when you're building a company is avoiding the shiny object syndrome. Like, oh, that's another thing we could do, or that's something we could do, or we haven't thought of that, right? It's just like this, and it's an onslaught, right? I mean, if you're in social media, it's like there's constant onslaught
yeah,
of new ideas, and you do this, and carousel on this, and the 5 steps to do this, and the new AI tool that you have to use. Like, it's just never ending, right? So if you don't have a couple of things to focus on, you're sucked into that. So what I encourage them to do is find their focus, in the sense that what are the things that business wise. So we have to bring in the next version of the product. We have to develop a clear inbound marketing strategy. We have to hire a marketing assistant to help us implement some of these things, right? So there's three things.
yeah,
And then what I also find is that a lot of them are some ways, intuitive decision makers, right? So they make decisions based on gut rather than on data.
Mhm.
And so what I think is really important is that at a certain stage, when you need to scale the business, which of course is the focus of kind of what we both do, you have to be able to measure your progress and make decisions based on data, not gut feeling, right? I mean, it's just there's a point at which
Yeah.
it feels right, just isn't a good enough reason, right? So what this enables you to do, and that's the performance management piece, is like, how do you track it? What do you track? Do you spend 30 minutes a week looking at your goals and see where you are versus them? Where's the gap? What do I need to change? So that
Yeah.
kind of process, and then finally taking all of those elements and applying them to a very slim but focused sales and marketing team with clearly defined roles and responsibilities. People know what they're doing. That altogether is going to give you that sort of structure that you can use to scale your operations as your business scales.
Yeah, for sure. That all makes a lot of sense. I think one of the challenges that often comes up, because I work with companies mostly on the execution side of things, and
Yeah.
often enough, ironically, we go backwards through this process. It's a very
Yep.
similar process, because the pains that you have in execution, like the pains that I discover, that which people come to me with, we can't execute. This, we're trying. We've got waste.
Yeah.
We're not focusing. We're not aligned. And then what's really going on here is we're not actually focused enough. We haven't built our systems well enough, and it's a bit broader than sales, but it's still the same kind of concepts. But I mean, so we go through all that sort of stuff. But one of the big things that comes up often is in execution, especially when you're talking about goal setting in, well, anything really, but in sales. Um, Early stages, at least, how do you set a goal for sales? Because, like, for my company, for example, for me, I can set a goal for sales all I like, but what really matters is, am I doing, do I have the right machine, and am I turning the handle, and am I putting the right inputs in? And then if the economy is doing well, I'll do well. But I can't really set a revenue goal at this stage. I'm not at the stage of my business where I can set a
Hmm.
revenue goal that is meaningful or helps me make decisions. Um,
Uh-huh.
what's your take on that? Like, at different stages, and how do you set those kinds of goals? And are you focusing on inputs or outputs, or what's going on?
Right, right. Well, look, you're talking to somebody who sits down at the end of each year and evaluates their progress and makes goals for the next year for my personal life as well. So I'm like a pretty goal
Yeah.
focused guy. So for me, setting goals is second nature. I think that for the purposes of revenue goals, like it's a good rally question. Like we just started out, or we had our first three customers. How do I know what my revenues are going to be? I
Yeah.
actually think that goals have a really important psychological impact. You might not be able to. In fact, it's unlikely you'll be able to set a very, very stringent goal based on a lot of detailed market analysis. You're going to pick a number that feels right,
Yep.
that somehow should be within reach with a bit of luck and a lot of hard work. And you set that goal, and a couple of things happen. First of all, it gives you something to track your progress against, right? So if you set a goal of 100, and you can be reasonably assume that roughly you'll have an even distribution of revenues over the course of the year. If you're not at 25 at the end of first quarter, you know, not bad. But if you're at 20, 30 or at 20, that's fine. But if you're at five, maybe that 100 is maybe
Unrealistic.
unrealistic, right? So it
Yeah.
gives you something to track your progress. The second thing it does is it gives you motivation to keep going. I've often find myself in situations, both in my corporate past as well as my entrepreneurial present, where, look, this is hard work. I mean, you got a lot of heavy lifting to do, and if you've got that goal in front of you, it gives you a bit of something to focus on to get you past those difficult
Yeah.
times. Just to work harder. And I'll be very honest with you, a very specific example, from my first quarter, I don't know, I set very specific revenue goals for myself. And I don't know, I was at like 95% for the first quarter of my own goal, which really pissed me off because I want to hit 100%. And of course, not nobody in the entire world knows about my goal except me. Right. So
Yeah.
it's literally it's just me. But I'll tell you
Yeah.
what, I did everything in my power to get that last deal over the table. And I did. And I closed at 100.5%. And just that
Yeah.
extra motivation just to get that last deal in, just for the purpose of saying I could hit my goal, was a big motivation for me, to do it. And so I think you can do that as an environment, for a startup. It just gives you something to shoot for.
Do you find, like, particularly because you have a sales and business development background,
Yeah.
right? You've
Hmm.
done this all your life. You're that type of person, if I may.
Yeah. Hmm.
And a lot of your customers are the tech founders, and the
Yeah.
tech and product founders, and they come from probably a very different perspective. And similar to me, I was a software developer and a systems
Yeah.
administrator. Went through the technical side of Deutsche Bank and then Google, and ended up on the business and product side
Yeah.
in the end. But I've certainly found learning this way of thinking quite unnatural and quite challenging sometimes, and I still resist it. And sometimes I'm resisting it, and I feel like it's right, and sometimes I'm resisting it. And I'm like, I shouldn't resist this to go down that path. But I mean, how do you deal with people who are, I guess, more like me in that sense of like, I'm a product person, and especially when they're like, you read the mythology of like Google, and when Google started, and I remember this clearly because I was a Google fanboy before I was a employee, seeing basically they just made a better search engine and everyone came. And we didn't do any marketing. And even when I joined in 2006, we had a tiny marketing budget. We barely did any marketing, ironically, for an advertising business, right? But we had no market. We almost did no marketing. And that was considered to be a good thing because it meant that you had to focus on your product and not your marketing and sales. I mean, they developed the sales team really rapidly. But it's just really interesting. And Google had this whole theory, this whole sort of like culture of like, especially in the engineering and product side, where we're the ones who make the money and the sales guys just collect it, right? Because that
Yeah,
was the
I
mentality,
guess.
but at least
Yeah,
back in 2006. So,
yeah.
I mean, how do you work with people who don't have this goal and mentality, or um, struggle to think about money in this sense?
hmm Well, the first thing I would say is I would say I almost only work with those type of people because the people with a bit of more sales and marketing background will look at me and say, "Well, I already know what you're going to say," right? Because they've
Yeah,
already done that, or they certainly perceive that to be true.
yeah,
So, 98% of my clients are product people. The second thing is what I think causes product people to be fearful of sales is because they believe it to be some sort of, mystical, you know, um, mystical requirement or mystical set of skills. One of my clients called it voodoo. Actually, like he said, sales and marketing was voodoo to me until we started working together. And I think what
yeah,
they really appreciate is that at the end of the day, the product people I know, and certainly the kind of developer types that know, are actually quite structured in their thinking, right? I mean, that you have to
yeah,
do that in order to actually build a product.
yeah,
So what I try to do is I try to take the voodoo out of sales and marketing and just make it into a structured process that you follow in order to achieve a desired outcome. And at the
yeah,
end of the day, most of my, I would say all of my clients are intelligent enough and aware enough to realize that you can have the world's greatest product, but if you're not going to sell it to anybody, you ain't building business, right? So you better get over your
yeah,
obstacles of feelings about sales. And so what I find to be very useful, and how I'm able to get these sort of product people on my side is because I tell them, I said, look, this is not voodoo. It's not about convincing people to buy something they don't need. It's actually creating a very structured, focused, specific set of steps that you follow that will eventually yield results. Now, obviously, you can execute those at different levels of professionalism or different levels, but
yeah,
if you do it, you will eventually succeed, and it might take you longer than you expected, but you're gonna succeed. And so, taking that mystical element out of sales and turning it into a much more process driven approach convinces, I think, these customers that I have that actually
yeah.
what I'm offering has value to them because they can relate to it.
One thing I found interesting about what you said there is also that you said it's about taking the video out, but then sales is not about selling people stuff that they don't need. And this really brings us back to focus, and it brings us back to the core of product management and the value of engineering and the value of R&D is that we want to build something that people do need. And the connection between sales and R&D and product and development and all that sort of stuff can be so fruitful because if you have those mentalities on both sides of the business, both parts of the business, because then you get this knowledge about what really is useful and how it really gets sold and why people really want it. And a lot of sales and marketing, a lot of marketing, certainly in my experience, is sometimes about filtering people out, not filtering people in. And it's about sort of trying to make a funnel that's like, okay, we get a very broad reach, but then we filter them out rapidly so we can invest in that narrow funnel down the bottom
Yeah,
there. We have few people because we know that they want our product and the other
yeah.
people don't want our product. So let's not waste time talking to them.
Absolutely. I mean, it goes back to identifying the right message to the right audience, and connecting those dots. You referenced this short statement I made about it's not about convincing people to buy something they don't need. I grew up in a family of academics. Both my parents were professors. They were incredibly intelligent and sophisticated, but they were extremely non-commercial in the way they approached the world. And to the point where, if one of these, I grew up in the United States where you get cold calls quite a bit, and we would get. I remember as a child, we would get calls from random. They were selling telephone services, and my mother would get the phone and pick up the phone, and she'd pretend to be the maid
Yeah,
and tell them that the Vardy family was away in Europe for the summer, so quit calling. Like that was the
yeah,
level of respect the salespeople got in my household.
yeah,
So I completely get that mentality, but what I learned, and the reason I became effectively a sales and marketing person, is because I had a guy, I used to work for Cartoon Network back in the mid 90s. And I had a boss who explained this to me in very simple terms. He said, look, you are there to solve a problem for somebody, right? You're
Yeah.
not there to sell them something they don't need. So if you just approach the entire process of I'm offering a solution to your problem, it changes your shift completely, mindset completely. And I
Yeah.
think that that is such a critical um, point of view to have, right? So as a tech founder, you're not there to create a product that people don't need. You're actually creating something that's going to solve an important problem for them. You're doing them a favor. It's just a
Yeah.
question of, do they recognize it, and can you offer it in the form that's going to make it easy for them to say yes?
Yeah,
And that
exactly.
and that type of approach, I think, is critical to have.
And so marketing, sales and marketing is really about helping them get to that point, helping them recognize it, helping
Yeah.
them reach them, communicate in the way they understand,
Yeah.
in a way that's broad enough that you reach them, and then helping them go down that decision making path
Yeah,
that
and
helps them.
you know you've done it right, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well. Is like, when you finish an assignment and you work with a client, they're actually incredibly grateful. They're like, oh,
Yeah.
thank you. And it's funny because I've often experienced this. Like the value proposition process is kind of my go-to one. That seems to be the biggest, has the biggest impact in the first module. And it's interesting to see, like, when you sit down, I've got this kind of 5-step process I take them through to identify this one sentence that they put together about their
Yeah.
business. And it's really interesting to to experience this, where we go through the process and I actually physically see them relax when it's done, because it's like, oh, okay, so that's what I'm selling. Oh, so that's what
Yeah.
makes me unique. Oh, that's the problem I solve. And they're, their shoulders relax, they smile, and it's like, and they're grateful, because it's like, there's this chaos in my mind, and now I can actually explain in a sentence what I
Yeah.
do. And I had one of my clients come back to me during the program. They went off to some industry conference and stuff. And he said, Zoltan, I came back and I had 50 conversations, and I just used my one sentence, and people understood what I was doing. It was amazing. And then they had follow-up questions, and then we had contact. It's like, just that simplicity of communication is so critical to get people to
It's
engage.
amazing. And it also makes that such a difference, because it also means that it becomes a lot easier to say no to the things that are not part of that sentence and not part of the fundamental value proposition. And then you don't have all this other distraction and so on. And you don't have all those other conversations with people you think, do I need to help them? Can I sell them something? And all that sort of stuff. Like, it's just like, oh, this is my sentence. That sounds really good, but it's not for me.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And
Let's move on.
well, yeah. And I always say this, the second best answer in sales is no. The worst is
Yeah, yeah,
maybe,
yeah.
because that's where you
Absolutely.
end up wasting a lot of time. So if you can get people to say yes, that's the best. If you can get them to say no, that's the second best. Because ultimately, then you don't waste your time on people who are not interested in what you're offering.
Exactly. And that's been a game changer for me as well. Um,
Yeah.
One of the things you said earlier on about the goal set process, which was interesting, which I wanted to explore a bit, was about tracking progress. And I,
Hmm.
tracking the progress, if you're a goal oriented person who's motivated by a goal, is certainly one thing. But then tracking it just in terms of like, where am I? Like, if I'm aiming for 100 and I hit 5 after the first quarter, now I've got a problem. What do you do in? I mean, I've got my own take on what to do in this situation. And this is how I work with OKRs. It's really about, you set a goal that you think is realistic. You come up with a plan that you think is going to get there, and then as you're going through, as you discover new things, and maybe if you're hitting 5 instead of 100, that's one thing. And if you hit 95 in the first quarter when you're aiming for 100 at the end of the year,
Yeah.
that's another thing. And you can
Those are called
change your
rich people.
goals.
Those are called rich people's problems.
Yes, it's a good problem to have. If you can have that problem, you're maybe sandbagged. But what's the thing how to make this goal setting process really useful? Because it's really about, my understanding is it's really about, I've set a goal of like sales to this or outreach to that many people, and I can't hit it. So now what do I do? And it's that now what do I do question, which is the real important thing.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if is that your experience as well, and is that something that is experience of your customers?
Absolutely. Look, there's no such thing as a perfect, goal and a perfect execution plan. Life happens, and you have to be able to adjust your attitude and actions based on what the real data is showing you. The first thing is tracking that you are at 5 and not at 95, right? I mean, that itself is already a very important step, and you'd be surprised how many people don't even take the time to actually where they are versus their spending or
Yeah,
their
yeah,
goals. They just kind of like, oh well, we booked another piece of business, that's great, but they don't have a sense of where they are in their journey. So once you've started tracking it, the benefit is you can then make an educated decision based on where you are in that progress. If you
yeah,
set 100 and you're at 5, obviously that's a problem, or that's a kind of red light, and say, okay, well, there's something to be done. I think there's no perfect solution or perfect formula for, well, do I have to reset the goal or I'd have to put more effort into it? I think everybody's got to make that
mm,
decision for themselves. But I think there is a point at which you have to reset, right? And you say to
yeah,
yourself, look, maybe 100 was really my dream scenario, but maybe 50 is much more realistic, and I'm going to now come up with a plan to at least hit 50. Right, but then you kind of leave
yeah,
yourself some ground for how do you outperform that second goal. And obviously, the more mature you are as a business, the more history you have, the more you can be more specific about the goals you set, because you've got some historical information, you've got an idea of where you want to be. So I think there's a matter of resetting, and then
yeah.
resetting also your action plan to get to that goal. What's your point of view?
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's exactly the way I use OKRs in an organization. But one of the complications that happens with this, and this is a controversy corner, we only got about 5 minutes left, but I'd love to hear your point of view on this one, is really about how this relates to compensation, especially in a
Yeah,
sales organization. And so,
yeah,
because everyone has you often have an incentive program. Not always. I've seen some organizations without incentive programs it works well, but usually there's an incentive program, and then you have goals. And how do these relate? And
yeah.
what's the complication here?
Well, I'll tell you what. I've got a great story, a personal story on this front, which just shows you how absurd this goal setting can become in big corporations. So when I was at NBC Universal, I was responsible for a business of, call it, about $150 million. And in the year that I joined the company, I had not actually set the goal, because I came after the goal was set, and I inherited a goal which was something in the lines of 20% growth year on year, which for a $150 million business is a pretty hefty growth, right?
Yep.
And we clawed our way to fought and clawed and everything, and we got to 17% growth. Right, 17% growth in a corporate environment is a pretty nice number, right?
Yeah.
I got my ass handed to me because we didn't hit our objective.
Yeah.
Next year, I said, "Oh, okay," and I did everything in my power to set a 5% growth target,
Yeah.
because I came up with all sorts of reasons why actually 5% growth is going to be the right number for the next year. And I had a boss who was supportive of that, and we got that over the line. We ended up generating 6% growth the following year. I got an extra bonus. So
Yeah.
what's the right management behavior? Do you want somebody who is going to shoot for 17% growth, or do you want somebody who's going to shoot for 6% growth?
Yeah.
And
Do you think that it was that? Do you think that that was that you could have done more if you had a more ambitious goal to push towards?
Well, it's difficult to recall every single element, but I sure as heck didn't claw as hard, right? I mean, obviously, I
Yeah.
would, I had
Right.
an objective, and I mean, if I'm going to be judged on an arbitrary goal somebody set, then that's fine. I mean, why do I
Yeah.
why do I put in the work for 17% growth when I'm actually going to bet a benefit from just growing 6% year on year?
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
this is to say that I think that the compensation structure in corporations is anything but entrepreneurial, right? Because can you imagine an entrepreneur being in a situation where, like, hey, good job, you only grew 6%, whereas
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
grew 70%, right? They'd be like, that's completely counterintuitive. We want to grow more and
Mm,
more every year, not less and less.
yeah.
And so I think that in a nutshell is, I think, why I left behind that corporate environment, to help founders build a sales machine that enables them to build those predictable revenues, because I think that's, at the end of the day, what leads to success. And if I can
Yeah.
help founders to bring their entrepreneurial dreams to life, and to do it in a way that enables them to build a long-term sustainable business, I mean, what could be better than that?
Yeah, exactly. That's motivating. Yeah, that's really, really good. Zoltan, I think we're pretty much out of time. It's been
Mhm.
really good talking to you. If people want to get in contact with you, what's the best way to do so?
Yeah. So first of all, on LinkedIn, I'm available on LinkedIn. The second is, and I wanted to offer this up as a special opportunity for your listeners. I've mentioned several times the value proposition process I described. So I've got a completely free, accessible tool that they can download if they go to zoltanvardy.com/podcast. they'll find a access to a 30-minute video and a worksheet they can download and get access to this whole process. And if after that they feel like it's something that they benefit from, they can reach out to me through the email or the website or LinkedIn, whatever works for them. But it's something that they can benefit from. So zoltanvardy.com/podcast.
Excellent. We'll put that into the show notes as well.
Great.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for your time, Zoltan. Everyone, that's everything we have for today. So, if you think you are looking for help with sales, sales and growth, and how to grow reliable revenue, Zoltan's your man. If you're looking for help with execution and how to do OKRs and how to set goals and how to set up a management system, I'm happy to help. You can go to book.talktorichard.com and schedule a time in my calendar. Look forward to hearing from you. If it's not a good time, you prefer to get updates, you can subscribe to my newsletter and follow me on LinkedIn. The links are in the show notes as well. Excellent. Have a great week and scale well.